A thick, silvery fog hung heavily over the quiet streets of the seaside town of Southport as the early morning light began to breach the horizon. The distant chimes of a centuries-old church bell echoed softly through the damp air, mingling with the rich, inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked bread escaping from small family bakeries. It was a crisp, late autumn morning, the kind of day when this coastal town seemed to move at its own peaceful, unhurried pace. Commuter buses glided smoothly down the main avenue, and the fallen autumn leaves rustled gently across the wet sidewalks under the light breeze. Beyond a set of towering, ornate iron gates stood the magnificent estate known as the Sterling Manor. Surrounding the residence were sprawling, manicured gardens and a cobblestone courtyard centered around an ancient stone fountain that bubbled continuously. Everything about the property radiated order, immense wealth, and refined taste. Yet, despite its grandeur, anyone passing through those heavy gates could immediately feel a profound, lingering silence. It was a house far too vast for a single man, harboring a quiet solitude that no amount of luxury could ever truly disguise. Arthur Sterling began his day with the rigid discipline that had defined his entire life. At his age, he sat at the helm of one of the most powerful corporate empires on the East Coast. He was a deeply reserved, methodical man, rarely allowing his true emotions to show on the surface. Decades of relentless ambition had filled his daily calendar with endless meetings and multi-million-dollar deals. Yet none of it had ever managed to fill the vast emptiness he had carried inside for years. Before sitting down for his morning meal, Arthur walked slowly toward a polished dark wood sideboard near the dining area. Resting upon it was a silver-framed photograph of his late wife. He paused, gently tracing the edge of the metal frame with his fingertips, his gaze fixed on her smile for a long, silent moment. Then, with a slow, practiced motion, he repeated every single morning. He turned the picture face down. It was not a gesture of forgetting. Rather, it was the only fragile mechanism he had devised to move through his day without being crushed by the weight of her absence. Only after the frame was hidden did Arthur take his seat at the long dining table. Julian Finch, the estate's longtime butler, stepped forward without a word and placed a silver tray before him, serving a hot cup of black coffee and a small plate of dry toast. "Good morning, sir," Julian murmured respectfully, his demeanor immaculate as always. "Thank you, Julian," Arthur replied softly, his eyes already drifting toward the window. As he ate in silence, Arthur watched the gentle autumn light sweep across the garden path outside. The steady splash of the fountain water was the only sound breaking the stillness, the very same sound that welcomed him home every evening when the massive manor grew dark and quiet again. Those who only knew Arthur through business saw him as a cold, unyielding titan of industry. Very few could have ever guessed that behind his formidable presence lived a man bound to a solitary life, trapped in a house where silence was his only constant companion. On the other side of Southport, in a modest two-bedroom apartment near the local public park, Abigail Rivers was helping her elderly mother button up her thick wool coat. "Mom, it is freezing outside today. Are you sure you want to come?" Abigail asked, wrapping a soft knit scarf around her mother's shoulders. "Oh, my dear girl, I have lived through far worse winters than this," Mrs. Margaret Rivers replied, with a serene, comforting smile. Despite her advanced age, Margaret possessed remarkably sharp eyes and hands that remained incredibly steady. Though Margaret had been retired for years, she never left the house without a small, worn leather pouch inside her handbag. Within it, she kept her essential medications and a single, critical epinephrine auto-injector, an absolute necessity due to a severe, life-threatening allergy she had lived with for decades. It was a lifelong habit, a simple precaution she refused to abandon no matter where she went. Abigail finished packing a small bag with a bottle of water, an apple, and her mother's medical kit. "You will have to come with me to the Sterling estate today, Mom. The neighbor who usually sits with you is down with a fever, and I cannot leave you home alone all day." Margaret patted her daughter's arm gently. "I do not want to be a burden on your workday, sweet child." Abigail smiled, kissing her mother's cheek. "Taking care of you will never be a burden, Mom." A short while later, a local taxi dropped them off at the heavy iron gates of the Sterling Manor. Samuel Briggs, the head of security for the property, greeted Abigail with a polite nod and pressed the button to unlock the side gate. While Abigail immediately set to work attending to her daily cleaning responsibilities inside the main house, Mrs. Margaret was invited to sit quietly on a bench near the courtyard, where she could enjoy the mild morning sun and the soothing sound of the stone fountain. As Margaret rested her hands on her lap, she noticed Julian, the butler, walking slowly down the outer stone corridor. He was carrying a heavy silver serving tray, holding 2 crystal wine glasses and a dusty, dark glass bottle of vintage red wine reserved only for special occasions. Just before he turned the corner toward the private wing of the estate, Julian slowed his pace for a brief second. He glanced quickly over both shoulders, checking the empty hallway as if ensuring that no one was watching him. Margaret subtly narrowed her eyes, watching him from her bench. In her long life, she had learned that events capable of shattering a human life rarely began with a dramatic explosion. More often, they started with a gesture so small and subtle that almost everyone chose to ignore it. Only those who had spent a lifetime observing human nature with patience knew how to recognize the quiet warnings hidden in plain sight. "Oh." The silence returned to the courtyard as soon as Abigail vanished down the long hallway leading to the upper guest bedrooms. Margaret remained on her wooden bench, watching the pale sunlight filter through the golden leaves of the maple trees. The gentle rhythm of the fountain water was almost hypnotic, yet the peaceful surroundings could not wash away the subtle knot of unease that Julian's secretive behavior had planted in her mind. Julian carried himself with the supreme confidence of a servant who had memorized every hidden corner of the Sterling estate over decades of employment. He turned into the private hallway that led directly to Arthur's executive home office. The moment he reached the dimly lit corridor, he slowed his steps even further. Convinced that he was entirely alone, he reached smoothly into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a small, folded paper packet. Margaret, who had quietly stepped closer toward the glass patio doors to admire the indoor plants, could not clearly see what was inside the packet. She only saw the white paper sliding between his fingers with a swift, remarkably practiced dexterity. With a fluid, silent movement, Julian tilted the neck of the dark bottle over one of the crystal glasses, emptied the contents of the paper packet inside, and gave the glass a very gentle, subtle swirl. It was a motion so natural, so perfectly executed, that anyone passing by would have assumed he was merely inspecting the glass for dust. Within a single second, Julian folded the empty paper packet back into his pocket, adjusted the arrangement on the tray, and restored his posture to its flawless, professional calm. He knocked twice on the heavy oak door of the study and stepped inside. Outside in the corridor, Margaret felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She could not say for certainty what had just been placed into that glass, nor could she prove that anything illegal had occurred. Yet her instincts, honed by decades of nursing and watching human behavior, told her that something deeply wrong was unfolding. The butler's secretive maneuver had awakened a profound dread inside her heart. Inside the study, Arthur was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk reviewing dense financial reports in preparation for a crucial international video conference scheduled for later that morning. His work was his sanctuary, focusing on market trends, complex contracts, and corporate strategy was the only way he knew how to keep the painful memories of his past at bay. Julian stepped into the room with an air of quiet reverence. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling. I thought you might appreciate a glass of your favorite vintage wine before your conference with the London board members?" Arthur looked up from his papers, his face exhausted, and offered a brief nod of appreciation. "Thank you, Julian. Leave it on the side table." The butler placed the tray down gracefully, adjusted the bottle, and retreated toward the door. Before stepping back into the hallway, he cast one final, fleeting glance toward the desk. A glance that lasted less than a second, but was long enough to confirm that Arthur was already reaching out his hand toward the crystal glass. From the corridor window, Margaret watched the interaction unfold with growing alarm. Driven by a sudden, overpowering instinct, she began walking slowly down the carpeted hallway, pretending to admire the antique oil paintings hanging along the walls. She did not want to cause a scene or appear intrusive, but her heart demanded that she verify her suspicions. Through the glass panel of the office door, she watched Arthur lift the crystal glass to his lips and take a slow, deliberate sip. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The wealthy businessman placed the glass back onto the table, picked up his pen, and turned a page of his report. Then, without warning, Arthur's body froze. His brow furrowed tightly as if a sudden violent pain had struck his throat. He dropped the pen, his hands flying up to clutch at his neck. He opened his mouth to gasp for air, but his chest remained locked. Within seconds, his face drained of all natural color, turning a dangerous, ghostly white, as severe swelling began to rapidly deform his neck and jawline. Margaret recognized those horrific symptoms instantly. She had seen severe anaphylactic shock enough times in her nursing career to know that death was only a matter of minutes away. Throwing all hesitation aside, she burst through the office door and rushed straight toward the collapsing man, pulling her small leather pouch from her purse as she ran. At the very same moment, Abigail, who was dusting the nearby library shelves, heard the heavy wooden door slam against the wall. Panicked by the sudden noise, she ran into the hallway, completely unaware that in a matter of moments, the lives of everyone inside the Sterling Manor were about to change forever. Arthur tried desperately to push himself up from his leather armchair, but his legs collapsed entirely beneath his weight. His lungs felt as though they were filled with cement, and the only sound escaping his throat was a raspy, agonizing wheeze. As he fell heavily to the hardwood floor, his arm struck the side table, sending the crystal glass crashing down. The glass shattered into a dozen pieces against the Persian rug, and the deep crimson wine spread rapidly through the fabric like a dark, sinister stain. "Abigail, call an emergency ambulance right now!" Margaret's voice boomed across the room with an absolute authority that instantly cut through the chaos. Abigail's hands shook violently as she pulled out her phone, dialing the emergency number with trembling fingers. She forced herself to speak clearly, giving the estate address and explaining that a man was suffocating and losing consciousness rapidly. Without wasting a single second, Margaret dropped to her knees beside Arthur's fallen body. She opened her leather pouch, grabbed her epinephrine auto-injector, and uncapped the needle guard. With a practiced, firm motion, she pressed the device firmly against the outer side of Arthur's thigh, right through his trousers. A sharp click resonated through the quiet room. "Stay still, Mr. Sterling. Keep your eyes on me," Margaret commanded softly, holding the injector in place for a full 10 seconds to ensure the full dose entered his bloodstream. She then gently laid his head back, monitoring his weak pulse and ensuring his airway remained as open as possible. For several agonizing seconds, Arthur continued to struggle violently for breath. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, the life-saving medication began to take effect. The aggressive swelling in his throat halted its advancement, and a tiny thread of air began to pass into his lungs. The ghostly paleness of his skin began to yield to a faint trace of color. He was still in critical condition, but the precious time Margaret had bought him was the thin line between life and death. Sir. At that precise moment, Samuel Briggs, the security chief, rushed into the study, followed by two uniformed security guards. His sharp eyes instantly took in the harrowing scene. The shattered glass on the floor, the dark wine stain, the fallen billionaire, and the elderly woman kneeling over him with total composure. "What on earth happened here?" Samuel demanded, his voice stern and tense. Abigail stammered, tears streaming down her face. He suddenly started choking. He couldn't breathe." Samuel looked down at the spilled wine and the bottle resting on the table, then looked back at Abigail and her mother. "Who brought this wine into the room?" Before Abigail could answer, Julian appeared at the threshold of the study, his face pale with an expression of utter shock and horror. "Dear God, what has happened to Mr. Sterling?" He rushed forward a few steps, but stopped at a respectful distance, placing his hands over his mouth as if overwhelmed by grief. To anyone watching, his reaction appeared entirely genuine. The panic of a loyal servant discovering a tragedy. In the distance, the sharp, wailing sirens of approaching emergency vehicles broke through the morning air. Paramedics rushed into the manor within minutes, taking over Arthur's care with practiced efficiency. As they prepared the stretcher, the lead paramedic looked up at Margaret, who was quietly explaining the exact timeline of symptoms and the dose of epinephrine she had administered. "You acted with extraordinary speed, ma'am," the doctor said, looking at Margaret with deep admiration. "If this medication hadn't been given when it was, his airway would have closed completely before we even reached the gates. You saved his life." Margaret merely nodded, accepting no praise. Her eyes remained fixed on Arthur as his eyes flickered open for a brief second. Though his vision was blurred, Arthur caught a faint glimpse of the gentle, calm face of the elderly woman looking down at him before darkness claimed his senses once more. As the paramedics wheeled the stretcher toward the waiting ambulance, Samuel stepped into the center of the study and raised his hand. "Nobody touches a single thing in this room," he declared firmly. "The glass, the bottle, and this entire office are sealed off until we know exactly what caused this. Every member of the staff will remain on the estate grounds until further notice." Julian bowed his head slightly, using the gesture to hide a dark, fleeting smile. He had planned this operation for months, and he was fully confident that within hours, all suspicion would fall squarely upon the most defenseless person in the house, the new cleaning woman, Abigail. The ambulance sped away down the coastal road, its sirens fading into the distance, leaving the Sterling manor shrouded in a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. The quiet that settled over the estate was no longer the peaceful solitude of a grand home, but a tense, suspicious silence filled with unspoken accusations. Samuel returned to the study after seeing the emergency crew out. He stood quietly in the center of the room, taking in every detail: the shattered glass, the dark wine stain, the open financial documents on the desk, and the quiet fear visible on the faces of the staff members gathered in the hall. "No one leaves this property until our initial investigation is complete," Samuel announced, his tone cold and unyielding. The employees exchanged nervous glances. Abigail felt a tight knot twist in her stomach. Her mind was spinning with worry for Mr. Sterling, the terrifying image of his gasping face repeating endlessly in her thoughts. Julian, meanwhile, maintained his flawless facade of deep distress. "Do you truly believe someone tried to harm Mr. Sterling?" Julian asked, his voice trembling with well-rehearsed disbelief. Samuel did not answer immediately. He leaned down slightly, inspecting the broken glass without touching it, before turning to one of his security guards. "Take high-resolution photos of everything in this room. After that, I want every single security camera tape from 6 o'clock this morning reviewed. I want to know every person who stepped into this corridor." Standing near her daughter, Margaret watched Julian closely. She remembered the small white packet, the butler's swift hand movement, and the subtle glance he had cast down the empty hallway. Those details pointed directly toward Julian, but Margaret knew that an old woman's suspicion was not legal proof. Accusing him without evidence would only allow the true culprit to cover his tracks. She chose to keep silent and wait. A few minutes later, Samuel's phone rang. It was the attending physician from the Southport Memorial Hospital. Samuel listened intently, his expression growing more serious by the second. "Thank you, doctor. Please keep me updated directly." Hanging up, he turned to the room. "Mr. Sterling is stable. The ER team confirmed he suffered a severe anaphylactic reaction caused by a concentrated chemical agent introduced into his system shortly before his collapse." A collective sigh of relief passed through the staff, except for Julian. A cold spike of anxiety pierced the butler's heart. As long as Arthur Sterling remained alive, the truth remained a threat. He needed to ensure that the blame was planted quickly and permanently elsewhere. The opportunity presented itself moments later when Samuel walked down the hall to review the initial CCTV footage with his team. Taking advantage of the momentary distraction as the other servants gathered near the kitchen, Julian casually walked past the service cart, where Abigail kept her cleaning supplies. Pretending to adjust a cleaning cloth that was hanging over the edge, Julian slid his hand deep into the lower compartment of the cart, slipping the empty, folded paper packet into the bottom of Abigail's personal tote bag. The entire movement took less than 2 seconds. When he straightened up, Julian wore the same sorrowful, anxious expression he had maintained all morning. Margaret, who was talking softly to her daughter a few yards away, caught the subtle movement out of the corner of her eye. She saw Julian leaning unnaturally close to Abigail's cart, his hand lingering where it had no reason to be. Before Margaret could say a word, Samuel returned to the hallway accompanied by 2 security officers. "We are going to conduct a routine inspection of all personal belongings and cleaning stations," Samuel announced calmly. "It is standard procedure." Abigail stepped forward willingly, taking a deep breath. She had nothing to hide and only wished for the truth to come out. She had no idea that mere moments ago, her innocent cleaning cart had been turned into the crime scene's centerpiece. The search proceeded methodically through the grand hallway. Samuel stood by as his officers systematically checked the supply closets, the break room lockers, and the service trays. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the quiet ticking of a long case clock in the corner, sounding like a heavy hammer against the silence. When the officer reached Abigail's cleaning cart, he began sifting through the microfiber cloths, spray bottles, and spare sponges. Suddenly, his hand paused near the bottom shelf. He pulled out Abigail's canvas tote bag, unzipped the side pocket, and extracted a small, tightly folded white paper packet. A suffocating silence fell over the room. Samuel immediately pulled a pair of sterile latex gloves from his pocket, slipped them on, and took the paper packet. He carefully unfolded the corners, revealing a tiny residue of fine white powder clinging to the interior paper folds. Every eye in the hallway turned toward Abigail. This cannot be," Abigail gasped, taking a step backward, her face draining of color. "That is not mine. I have never seen that paper in my life." Samuel kept his gaze locked on her, his face unreadable. Are you absolutely certain, Abigail? It was tucked inside your personal bag. I am completely sure. Abigail's voice broke, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I have worked in this house for 2 years. I would never, ever hurt Mr. Sterling. There was no anger in her voice, only absolute crushing bewilderment. Julian let out a long, tragic sigh, stepping forward with a look of pained disappointment. It is truly heartbreaking, Julian murmured softly to the surrounding guards. One never truly knows what desperate financial strain can drive a person to do. She was always so quiet. The subtle accusation hung in the air like poison, instantly planting seeds of doubt among the other staff members. My daughter is telling the truth, Margaret said firmly, stepping between Abigail and the security team. Her voice was remarkably steady, carrying a quiet power that forced everyone to listen. Samuel looked at the elderly woman with respect. Can you prove that, Mrs. Rivers? Margaret paused, choosing her words with extreme care. I cannot prove it with physical evidence at this very moment. But I saw that man, she said, pointing a clear, unwavering finger directly at Julian. Leaning over my daughter's cart just 5 minutes ago when everyone was looking toward the front entrance. And I saw him handling a paper packet just like that one outside Mr. Sterling's office this morning. Julian's face flushed with momentary anger before he quickly restored his wounded composure. That is absurd. The poor woman is simply trying to protect her daughter from the consequences of a terrible crime. I have served the Sterling family faithfully for over 25 years. Samuel looked between Julian and Margaret. He was a seasoned investigator who did not believe in easy answers. When evidence appeared too conveniently during a frantic moment, his professional training told him to be cautious. We will let the forensic laboratory decide whose fingerprints are on this paper, Samuel stated firmly. The packet, the wine bottle, and the broken glass are all going to the state police lab immediately. Just then, Samuel's phone chimed with a high-priority notification. It was a direct message from the hospital's chief of surgery. Arthur Sterling had fully regained consciousness. Though weak, he was completely lucid and demanding an immediate report on the situation at his home. The news hit Julian like a physical blow. The butler felt his chest tighten as a cold panic began to settle into his stomach. As long as Arthur was alive and speaking, the investigation would not simply close with Abigail's arrest. A thorough investigation would trace the financial trail back to its source, back to Richard Sterling, Arthur's greedy younger cousin, who had offered Julian a life-changing fortune to quietly eliminate the family patriarch. Julian glanced nervously at the small security dome camera mounted high in the corner of the corridor. He remembered that its wide-angle lens captured part of the hallway leading to the study. He had assumed he was in the camera's blind spot, but now doubt began to consume him. He realized that the greatest threat to his freedom was no longer just the security chief, but the unwavering determination of an old woman who refused to let justice be subverted. Night fell over the town of Southport, bringing with it a steady, cold rain that washed over the manicured lawns of the Sterling estate. Inside a private room at Southport Memorial Hospital, Arthur Sterling lay resting against raised pillows. Though his voice was still somewhat raspy, his mind was razor-sharp. He listened intently as Samuel sat beside his bed, detailing everything that had transpired after the ambulance had left the estate. Samuel explained the discovery of the white packet in Abigail's bag, Julian's accusations, and the quiet, unyielding resistance of Margaret Rivers. Arthur listened without interrupting a single word. When Samuel finished, the wealthy businessman looked out the window at the rain sweeping across the glass. You say the mother was the one who administered the epinephrine? Arthur asked softly. Yes, sir, Samuel replied. Her name is Margaret Rivers. She is a retired nurse. The ER doctors explicitly stated that her immediate intervention is the sole reason you are alive right now. Arthur closed his eyes, recalling the faint, foggy memory of that terrifying moment, the suffocating weight on his chest, the darkness closing in, and then the steady, calm eyes of an elderly woman holding his shoulder, telling him to hold on. "I have known Abigail for 2 years, Samuel," Arthur said slowly, opening his eyes. "She is an honest, hard-working woman. She has never shown a single trace of deceit. Frame jobs are designed to be simple and obvious, so that people stop asking questions." "I agree, sir," Samuel nodded, "which is why I have not pressed charges against anyone yet." "Good," Arthur said, his voice hardening with authority. "I want you to bring the complete security server recordings here to the hospital. Every angle, every camera, from 6 o'clock this morning until the moment the police arrived. I want to review them personally." "That will take hours of footage to go through, Mr. Sterling," Samuel warned gently. "I do not care if it takes all night," Arthur declared firmly. "Someone tried to murder me in my own home, and they tried to destroy an innocent family's life to cover their tracks. We will watch every single minute." Meanwhile, back at the Sterling Manor, the atmosphere inside the servants' quarters was agonizing. Abigail sat at a small wooden table, her hands wrapped around a mug of warm tea that had long since gone cold. She looked at her mother with deep anxiety in her eyes. "Mom, what if the police don't believe us? What if Julian's story is the one they accept?" Margaret reached across the table and covered her daughter's trembling hands with her own strong, warm grip. "Listen to me, Abigail. Lies are like dry autumn leaves. They make a lot of noise, but the first strong wind blows them away. The truth does not need to shout. It simply stands firm. We did nothing wrong, and we will not run from the shadows." In his private quarters on the 3rd floor of the estate, Julian paced back and forth like a caged animal. His phone vibrated violently on his desk. He picked it up to see an encrypted message from Richard Sterling. "Is the matter finalized? Is the estate yours to manage?" Julian's hands shook as he typed back, "There are complications. The target survived. Security is reviewing full archives." A moment later, Richard replied, "Fix it immediately, or you will take the fall alone." Julian stared at the screen, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He realized that the walls were closing in on him fast. His elaborate plan, constructed over months of careful calculation, was crumbling because an old woman had happened to bring her medical bag to work that morning. The rain continued to pour relentlessly through the midnight hours as Arthur Sterling, sitting in his hospital bed with an IV line attached to his arm, watched a large laptop screen set up on a rolling tray before him. Samuel sat beside him, operating the video playback software. They had already spent 4 painstaking hours reviewing the footage. They watched the staff arrive, watched Abigail begin her morning duties, and watched Margaret take her seat by the fountain. "Pause it right there," Arthur commanded suddenly, pointing a thin finger at the screen. Samuel hit the spacebar. The video froze. It was a feed from an auxiliary camera positioned near the courtyard entrance, angled toward the glass corridor. "Zoom in on the reflection in the glass door," Arthur said, his eyes narrowing. Samuel zoomed in, adjusting the contrast and sharpness. Though the main corridor camera had missed Julian's hands due to his body angle, the high-resolution glass reflection showed the butler's movements clearly. The reflection showed Julian pulling the paper packet from his coat, tilting the wine glass, pouring the white powder into the vintage red wine, and swirling it gently before stepping into Arthur's office. Arthur stared at the screen, a profound sense of betrayal and sadness washing over him. Julian had been with his family for over 2 decades. He had trusted the man with his home, his safety, and his daily life. Yet, for money, Julian had been willing to end his life without a second thought. "Continue to the hallway feed right after the paramedics arrived," Arthur said, his voice cold and resolute. Samuel fast-forwarded the footage. A few minutes later, the tape showed the chaotic scene in the corridor after Arthur had been carried out. As the staff gathered near the front entrance, the camera captured Julian stepping toward Abigail's unattended cleaning cart. The angle was crystal clear. Julian reached deep into the lower compartment of the cart and dropped the folded paper packet directly into Abigail's bag. "That is all the proof we need," Samuel said quietly. "I am calling the police department right now." "Wait," Arthur said, raising his hand. "Do not call them to the manor yet. I want to be there when he is confronted. I want him to look me in the eye when his betrayal is exposed." Early the following morning, a sleek black town car pulled up to the main entrance of the Sterling Manor. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the morning air cool, crisp, and extraordinarily clear. Arthur Sterling stepped out of the vehicle, supported by a wooden cane. Though still visibly weakened by his ordeal, his posture was upright, and his presence carried an unmistakable power. Samuel walked beside him, holding a secure flash drive containing the processed video evidence. When Arthur walked through the heavy front doors into the main foyer, the entire staff was assembled, waiting nervously. Abigail and Margaret stood together near the grand staircase, while Julian stood near the dining hall entrance, trying desperately to maintain his composed, dignified expression. Seeing Arthur walking under his own power, Julian felt his knees go weak. He forced a warm, relieved smile onto his face and stepped forward. "Mr. Sterling, what a miraculous blessing it is to see you back home. We were all praying so fervently for your recovery." "Save your prayers, Julian," Arthur interrupted, his voice echoing sharply through the vast foyer. Arthur motioned to Samuel, who stepped forward and plugged the flash drive into the large display screen located in the main library adjacent to the hall. The video playback began immediately, displaying Julian's precise actions in clear, undeniable detail. First, the poisoning of the wine, and then the deliberate planting of the evidence in Abigail's tote bag. The hallway fell into absolute, breathless silence. The other servants gasped in shock, looking at Julian with utter disgust. Julian's face turned deathly pale. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some desperate excuse, but no words came out. His hands trembled uncontrollably at his sides. Two local police officers, who had been waiting quietly in the security room, stepped into the foyer and placed heavy steel handcuffs around Julian's wrists. "Julian Finch, you are under arrest for attempted murder and obstruction of justice," the lead detective stated firmly, leading the disgraced butler toward the waiting police cruiser outside. As Julian was escorted out, he refused to look at anyone, his head bowed in complete defeat. With the dark cloud finally lifted from the estate, Arthur turned his attention toward the two women who stood quietly near the staircase. He walked slowly over to Abigail and Margaret, resting both hands on the top of his cane. "Abigail," Arthur said, his voice soft and deeply genuine, "I owe you a profound apology for the suspicion that was cast upon you in my home. You have been a faithful, honest employee, and your dignity through this nightmare has been extraordinary." Abigail wiped a tear from her eye and smiled gently. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I am just so deeply grateful that you are safe and healthy." Arthur then turned his gaze toward Margaret. For a long moment, the powerful billionaire simply looked at the humble, retired nurse. The cold, unyielding exterior that Arthur had worn like armor for so many years seemed to melt away entirely. "Mrs. Rivers," Arthur said, his voice trembling with genuine emotion, "you saved my life. When everyone else froze in fear, you stepped forward without a single second of hesitation. You used the very medication you needed for your own survival to pull a stranger back from the edge of death. Margaret offered a calm, modest smile, resting her hands over her purse. Mr. Sterling, when a life is in danger, there is no time to calculate cost or comfort. I did what any person ought to do for another. You gave me a second chance at life, Arthur replied, shaking his head in wonder. And in doing so, you showed me how empty my life had become. I spent decades building an empire of stone and wealth, believing that money was security. But yesterday, I learned that all the riches in the world cannot buy a single heartbeat of genuine human goodness. Arthur immediately announced that he was establishing a permanent, fully funded charitable foundation in Margaret's name, dedicated to providing free emergency medical care and essential medications to elderly individuals and low-income families throughout the state. Furthermore, he promoted Abigail to the head manager of the Sterling estate operations, ensuring her family would enjoy financial security and peace for the rest of their lives. In the weeks that followed, the Grand Sterling Manor was no longer the quiet, gloomy fortress it had been for years. The heavy iron gates were frequently open, welcoming visitors, charity organizers, and community members. The sound of laughter and lively conversation filled the grand halls, replacing the cold, heavy silence of the past. Arthur Sterling spent his remaining years not in solitary isolation, but surrounded by new friends, actively serving his community and finding true joy in the simple, profound act of giving. This story reminds us that the true measure of a person's worth is never found in the vastness of their material wealth, the grandeur of their home, or the power of their title. True nobility lives in the quiet integrity of the human heart, in the courage to act with selfless compassion when someone else is in need, and in the willingness to protect the innocent even when the odds seem stacked against them. Life often presents us with moments where a simple, honest act of kindness can break through years of coldness and isolation, lighting a path toward redemption and hope. As we walk through our own journeys, may we remember that material possessions will eventually fade into dust, but the love, mercy, and goodness we share with others will echo far beyond our own lifetime, leaving a warm light in a world that so often needs it.